Good evening and welcome to Rants and Raves, my video blog. This episode is called, What is this thing called civilization that we talk about? After all, I've been talking about civilization, Western civilization, the need to defend Western civilization, so it might help if we knew what we were talking about. Well, okay. Civilization comes from the Latin word civis, which means city. Now, in Greek, the word for city is polis. Civis is the origin of the words civilized, civilization, civic, and such. Polis, of course, is the origin of the word politics, political, politician. They both have to do with city, i.e. men who live in large groups. Civilization is the organization of human society into groups larger than what you might call the natural number, which is sometimes called Dunbar's number, which is not a number, it's a range somewhere between 150 to 250. That is the number of people you can actually know more or less personally, or at least recognize. There. Civilized men are men who live in cities or large groups. Now, of course, the challenge of living in large groups is different from the challenge of living in a small hunter-gatherer band, and we're going to deal with that for a moment. We all know that in some way civilization is founded in agriculture. This is when we started actually growing our food rather than gathering it and hunting it. The origins of agriculture are not known. We don't. There was once an incredibly naive idea that human beings invented agriculture as soon as they stumbled on the idea that plants come from seeds. Well, we got disabused of that when we asked some of the surviving hunting and gathering peoples, do you know where plants come from? They say, yeah, seeds, dummy. You got any more questions like that? If you're gathering food, you can't avoid knowing they come from seeds. And probably very early in the game, you kind of get the idea of, okay, I've got these seeds left over. I'm not going to eat them. I'll throw them over there, and maybe next year there'll be something there that I can gather. But of course, by agriculture, we mean something beyond what's called sedentary horticulture. That is, basically gardening. So what we do know is that all state-level societies, which is related to but a bit different from civilizations, from cities, that all pristine state societies, meaning state societies that had an independent origin, that were not borrowed from somewhere else. And the last I looked in anthropology, the estimate of how many times this thing called the state has been invented, maybe 3 to 5 times, maybe more, but it's difficult to tell, because if you're counting the Valley of Mexico and Highland Peru, well, the idea might have spread, but they're not really in close contact with each other. It occurs in Egypt, of course. It occurs in, as I mentioned, Peru, the Valley of Mexico, Southeast Asia, and North China, and apparently in Polynesia, though I don't know much about that. Some say Tahiti invented the state independently of others. But what all of these places have in common is that they are areas of what they call circumscribed agricultural land, meaning not just agriculture, but agricultural land that is surrounded by land which is not suited for early agriculture. The other thing we know is that all early civilizations, all early state societies start with large-scale water control projects, either irrigation, as in Mesopotamia, Iraq, and Egypt, or drainage, as in places like Southeast Asia and such, and in places like Ireland, which achieved a high level of civilization but no central state until one was given to them by the English. Beware of Englishmen bearing gifts, they used to say, or something like that. So the thing about a large-scale water control project is, one, it's very, very decentralized. There isn't like a center where you open and close gates or anything like that. What's significant about these is that they can cover very large areas, but for it all to work, everybody has to do their bit in maintaining their piece of it. There has to be large-scale cooperation. They have to be maintained, or if one person slacks off and doesn't maintain their patch of it, the ditches silt up, which results in either flooding or inadequate irrigation. So here you have large-scale cooperation. You have laws, not only laws that don't do this, but laws that say do this. Do keep your piece of the irrigation ditch network, reasonably well maintained, so that the water flows everywhere. But this is what we would call a necessary but not sufficient condition for the origin of the state. Where state societies originate is agriculture, which produces surpluses of grain, which are used, of course, to feed livestock, of course, to make bread. Very early invention of some civilizations, the bread, and this delightful new stuff that they probably found out when they had some spoiled grain, beer. They invented beer. There are even some who think that grain was cultivated to make beer before it was cultivated to make bread. But at any rate, what you now have is the necessity for defending things. And that's where you get a state. I mentioned previously that in my series Ruling Class Crisis that ruling classes arise, and they arise because they perform three functions, which are land, ownership of land, usually and very often the people on the land; arms, that they are military specialists; and knowledge, that they are knowledge specialists. And the origin of this was the people who tracked the seasons. Even in non-state societies that live in something like cities, like the Puebloan tribes of the American Southwest, to this day they still have a tribal official who's called Sun Watcher. He watches the sun through an aperture in a wall in which he can track and he can name the dates of the solstices and the equinoxes. And again, if you are practicing agriculture, this is incredibly important. In Egypt, it told you when the Nile was going to rise and fall. They also invented calculus, by the way, for calculating the volumes of land area and such. Now, the whole thrust of the series I'm doing here, in my capacity as your humble narrator and anthropologist, is a certain set of assumptions about civilization, which I would like to share with you. This is, of course, my point of view, which you are free to agree with or disagree with. Disagree is, after all, what free men do. Now, if you agree with me, fine. We're going to get along fine. If you have some disagreements, that's cool too. Then we'll refine this. Maybe we'll refine this model together. If you disagree with me, well, you'll get the warm glow of satisfaction of knowing that you have identified yet another rat-fink enemy of progress and all that is good. So, these are the basic points. These are some things that, the points that I argue from in this series, and they underlie everything else about this. Civilization is a good thing. There is a difference between civilized and savage, civilized and uncivilized. It is real, and it is not racism. Civilization can go bad. We know that. We've seen a lot of it in the last century. Civilization can go bad, and when it does, it can be more destructive than any savage tribe ever could be. Obviously, civilization could stand some improvement. The civilization, I think, most likely to improve and evolve into something better and stick a pin and evolve is Western civilization, the one we call Western civilization. Now, the reason for this, I believe, is that Western civilization has evolved cultural, political institutions that support a greater degree of individual liberty than any other civilization, current, contemporary, or previous. The result of this has been an explosion of wealth and prosperity unequaled in human history. We are richer now, as the human species is richer now than it ever has been in the past. Western civilization is richer now than pretty much all the rest of the world. Now, this has created its own problems. The wealth leisure of civilization, because nothing is free, it comes with problems. The Western countries which have achieved this to the greatest extent are the English-speaking countries. I don't think that's disputable either. Even people who hate Western civilization rely on the law that was evolved in first from the Germans and then from an offshoot of the German family of nations and languages, the English, the Anglo-Saxon. By the way, I'm not Anglo-Saxon, so it's not like I'm special pleading for my own. The Western country that has been the most successful at this to date, on a large scale at least, is the United States of America. Now, say the survival and success of liberty and progress depends for the foreseeable future on the survival of Western civilization. Survival of Western civilization for the foreseeable future depends on the survival of the United States as a free country. Western civilization in general, and the United States in particular, have external enemies that desire our destruction. So what else is new? How is this any different from any time in history? Western civilization in general, and the United States in particular, have internal enemies who desire their destruction and are willing to cooperate with the external enemies to bring this about. I have touched on this in my Ruling Class Crisis series, the episode entitled, Yes, They Really Hate America and Western Civilization. Now, the internal enemies of the U.S. and the West come not from the ranks of the poor and dispossessed, but from the most affluent, educated, and privileged classes of their societies. These are the people you'd expect would have the most stake in preserving civilization, and yes, I dealt with that in that same chapter of Ruling Class Crisis. So, the defenders of Western civilization and the tradition of individual liberty are divided among themselves. This is a good thing in terms of intellectual diversity and dynamism, but it's a bad thing in terms of coordinated action. Nothing's free. There is a very real possibility of the United States breaking down into tyranny, disunity, disorder, or civil war. I will touch upon some of these in another episode, in which I think likely and which I think unlikely, but i.e., what it means is that we could revert to the norm of history. If this happens, the survival of the West is in serious doubt. Now, the perennial problem of free societies is how to be strong, rich, free, and unified all at once. There has not yet been found a permanent solution to this problem. There may not be one. Alright, so folks, that's basically an outline of where I'm coming from. And this is the larger subtext of all of these presentations that I'm doing right now. Now, I would like to go back to that point about civilization. When I say civilization is a real thing, there is a real difference between the civilized and the uncivilized, and as I say, it's not racism, because civilization is something you are socialized into. It is part of the wetware, the software wetware up here. It is, you are not born civilized. In fact, you're born savage, and if we do not keep maintaining civilization, it reverts. It reverts to lower levels of unity on a smaller scales that cannot maintain this large, complex society. And in future presentations, we'll deal with what the question of complexity is. Right now, I would like to point out something we call the progress of civilization. So if we've established that civilization is people living in groups larger, than the natural order, Dunbar's number back there, the natural size of a hunter-gatherer band, which is still, for example, by the way, that's you can see that number in places like Hutterite colonies and such. They get to a certain size, they don't expand, they don't continue to expand, they start another colony. That size is around Dunbar's number. There, about the average size of a hunter-gatherer band. So obviously, civilization is the incorporating of larger and larger groups of people in a self-identified thing. Now, not everybody identifies with their civilization, but for example, we almost always do have a sense, the idea that we are culturally more similar to each other. We British, we Americans, we Germans, we French, Italians, and such. We know that we're more similar to each other than we are, for example, the Chinese, the Japanese, the Koreans, and the Vietnamese. There is a different civilization in there. But we have recently, in Western civilization, we've achieved something rather remarkable, is that we seem to have other non-Western countries who are joining us in some of the basic assumptions of Western civilization, which have to do with things like the rule of law, security of property, that we're basically individualist, that we consider the basic unit of civilization to be the individual and not the clan, not the ethnicity or anything. Notice also that so-called progressives are actually dragging civilization backwards. They're insisting that the natural unit of society is the ethnicity, like that. We had gone beyond that. We had evolved beyond that, and that is another question. Do civilizations evolve in a meaningful way? Well, yes, I believe they do. Again, another time. I'm trying to keep this fairly short. Now, what we call, obviously from this, say what we call the progress of civilization means the expansion of the in-group, the expansion of the group we identify with. Us anthropologists talk about in-group, out-group identity and things like that. So what is the in-group? The in-group consists of those people you are obliged to act ethically towards. These are the people whom you have to treat according to the ethical codes that you were socialized in. And ethics is a big subject, not germane to this right now. But what do I mean? How does this affect the prospect of the progress of civilization? Is this. The progress of civilization is the expansion of the in-group, is the notion that we socialize into each other, that you are morally obliged to act ethically. You are obliged to act morally towards a larger and larger group of people. As I said, progressives have dragged us back a little bit. Not nearly as bad as the Nazis did in the last century, for example, when they said, no, you're only, they basically dropped out of civilization and said, no, you're only obliged to act ethically towards your fellow Aryans, your fellow Germans, whatever. Like that's one of the reasons why their emergence in the most civilized country in Europe just blew everybody's mind. So this is where I'm coming from. This is what I mean by civilization, and why I contend that the survival of the West is of great importance to the human race as a whole. Now, the problem with this is that we have achieved this belief, at least among the intelligentsia, at least among first perhaps among certain educated classes, but it seems to have spread. We have the notion that the in-group, the people we are obliged to act ethically towards, is the whole human race. And this would seem to be the end result that all the progress of civilization is heading for, has been heading for some time, since the human race first started living in groups larger than the natural number of groups, the natural hunter-gatherer band sized. Now, this is also the problem. The problem is that this idea has not spread evenly throughout the human race. Now, there are other civilizations. You could point to Islamic civilization, in which the notion of the brotherhood of believers is very real. It's a real notion on the ground, and when they came up for it for its time, it was quite progressive. It was the notion that all you have to do is believe certain stuff. And now we would we would like to do that on a basis other than religion, because in religion not everybody agrees with each other. Christian civilization did the same thing. If you were recognizably Christian, then okay, there was some sense that you were, even though we incessantly war on each other, and that's another one of the unique characteristics of Western civilization. We argue about why, but the fact is, nobody argues that Western civilization, when it turns its attention to war, is uniquely lethal. It's lethal on a scale people in the past could not have imagined. And thus, when it goes wrong, it is terribly, terribly destructive. So, we have a situation here in the history of the human race in which we seem to be evolving. We've evolved a civilization which regards the in-group, at least theoretically, as the whole human race. That's a good place to be, except there are some people who don't see it that way. And the question is, does that put us at a disadvantage in dealing with them? We are possibly creating a meta-civilization, the notion that non-Western cultures can adopt certain values such as the rule of law, equality under the law, things of that sort, that make them part of this complex that may be bigger than Western civilization. Now we're getting into speculation, though I would point out to you that some of those things we like about our civilization are not universally shared. If you have ever read James Clavell's novel Taipan, there's the character, the delightful Lady Chong Mei Mei, who is the Scottish Taipan's Chinese concubine. He bought her in a market transaction, and she came to love him dearly, loves him, adores him. Thinks he can become civilized, but she flat does not understand this insane barbarian idea of one law for the rich and poor alike. What's the point of scraping and working and sacrificing to become rich if you have to obey the same law as poor people? Now note something about that, is that idea is insane. I mean, you're laughing right now. We think that idea is funny, but it's not insane. It's a perfectly sane and rational approach. It's just not one we like there. So, again, I would like to cut it off about now, because these things have been tending to run long lately. This has been Rants and Raves. I hope I've given you some food for thought, and I would like to urge you to have a look at my book, The View from Flyover Country. A rural columnist looks at life in the 21st century, which is available on Amazon Kindle. There's another book, one at least, called The View from Flyover Country, not to be mistaken. Alrighty, this has been Rants and Raves. Thank you very much, and we'll see you later and talk about some other cool ideas. Okay.